No one is coming. No perfect opportunity is waiting around the corner. No sudden moment where everything aligns and your life becomes easier. No one is going to step in, take control, and build the future you keep thinking about. And that truth is uncomfortable, because it removes the idea that something external will fix what you haven't changed. It removes the belief that time alone will solve your problems. It forces you to confront something most people avoid: responsibility. For a long time it's easy to wait, to believe that things will improve when conditions are better, when you feel more ready, when the timing is right. But that moment keeps moving. It never fully arrives. And while you wait, nothing changes. But the moment you accept that no one is coming, something shifts. You stop depending on circumstances. You stop expecting help that isn't guaranteed. You stop delaying action in the hope that something will push you forward. And instead you take control. Not in a dramatic way. Not overnight. But through small, consistent decisions. Through actions that don't rely on motivation or perfect timing. Through discipline that comes from within, not from pressure around you. This audiobook is not about waiting for change. It's about creating it. Because your life is not shaped by what might happen. It is shaped by what you choose to do, daily, consistently, without relying on anything outside of you. And once you understand that, you stop looking for someone to save you. You start building something that no one else can take responsibility for. Your own direction. Chapter 1. Accept the reality without resistance. There is a moment that defines the direction of your life more than any opportunity, advantage, or external support ever will. It is the moment you stop resisting reality. Not the version of life you wish you had. Not the version you believe you deserve. But the version that exists right now, unfiltered, unedited, and undeniable. Most people spend a significant part of their lives in quiet resistance. They resist their current situation. They resist their limitations. They resist the gap between where they are and where they want to be. And while this resistance may feel justified, it comes with a cost. Because every moment spent denying reality is a moment not spent changing it. Resistance creates delay. When you refuse to accept where you are, you also refuse to fully engage with what needs to be done. You stay caught in a mental loop, thinking about what should have happened, what could have been different, or what might change in the future. But none of that alters the present. And the present is the only place where action exists. Acceptance is not weakness. It is not giving up. It is not settling. It is clarity. When you accept your reality, you remove distortion. You stop looking at your life through the lens of expectation and start seeing it as it is. You identify what is working and what isn't. You recognize the patterns that have brought you here. And most importantly, you understand the starting point from which change must begin. Without acceptance, you build on assumptions. You set goals without understanding your current position. You create plans that ignore your actual habits. You expect results without addressing the real problems. And because of that disconnect, progress becomes inconsistent. Frustration builds. And eventually you feel stuck, not because change is impossible, but because your foundation was unclear. Reality is your foundation. It does not need to be perfect. It does not need to be ideal. It only needs to be accurate. Because accuracy allows direction. And direction allows movement. There is also an emotional component to resistance. Accepting reality often means confronting uncomfortable truths. It means acknowledging that certain results are a consequence of your own actions or inaction. It means letting go of the idea that things will change on their own. And that discomfort is what keeps many people in denial. But avoiding discomfort does not eliminate it. It prolongs it. When you face reality directly, the discomfort is temporary. It sharpens your focus. It pushes you toward action. But when you avoid it, the discomfort becomes constant, hidden beneath distraction, justification, and delay. Acceptance simplifies everything. It removes confusion. It removes unnecessary thinking. It replaces, "Why is this happening?" with "What can I do about it?" And that shift, from questioning to acting, is where progress begins. You also begin to reclaim energy. Resistance consumes mental energy. It keeps you stuck in thoughts that do not lead to action. Acceptance, on the other hand, redirects that energy. It channels it into solutions, into decisions, into movement. And over time, that energy becomes momentum. Another important aspect of acceptance is that it removes dependency on external change. When you are waiting for circumstances to improve before you act, you give up control. But when you accept your current situation fully, you begin working within it. You stop waiting for better conditions and start creating better outcomes with what you have. This is where strength is built. Not in ideal situations, but in real ones. Not when everything is aligned, but when things are uncertain. Because acting in imperfect conditions develops resilience. It forces you to adapt. It teaches you to move forward without guarantees. Acceptance also brings honesty into your process. You stop overestimating your efforts and underestimating your patterns. You see clearly what you are doing consistently, not what you intend to do, but what you actually do. And that honesty becomes the basis for change. Because you cannot improve something you are not willing to see accurately. There is a difference between wishing for a better life and building one. Wishing keeps you in resistance. Building starts with acceptance. You don't need to like your current situation. You don't need to feel satisfied with where you are. But you do need to acknowledge it fully. Because until you do, every attempt to move forward will be misaligned. Acceptance is not the end of effort. It is the beginning of effective effort. It gives you a clear starting point. It removes illusion. It directs your focus. And it prepares you to take responsibility for what comes next. Because once you stop resisting reality, you stop wasting time. And when you stop wasting time, you start moving forward. Chapter 2. Take full responsibility for your life. There is a clear dividing line between people who remain where they are and those who move forward. It is not intelligence, luck, or opportunity. It is responsibility. The willingness to take full ownership of your life, your actions, your decisions, and your outcomes, without shifting the cause to anything outside of you. Responsibility is often misunderstood. Many people see it as pressure, as burden, as something that limits freedom. But in reality, responsibility is the opposite. It is what gives you control. Because the moment you accept that your life is shaped by what you do, you also accept that you have the power to change it. Without responsibility, you remain dependent. You depend on circumstances improving. You depend on other people behaving differently. You depend on motivation, timing, and external conditions aligning in your favor. And when those things don't happen, you stay in the same place. Not because change is impossible, but because you've given control away. Blame is the alternative to responsibility. And it is one of the most limiting patterns you can adopt. Blame feels justified. It gives you a reason for why things aren't working. It protects your self-image. It shifts attention away from your own actions. But it also removes your ability to act. Because if the problem is outside of you, the solution must also come from outside of you. And that leaves you waiting. Responsibility eliminates that weight. It forces you to look at your situation and ask a different question. Not, who is at fault? But, what can I do now? That question is direct. It is actionable. And it leads to movement. Taking responsibility does not mean everything that happens to you is your fault. There are factors you cannot control. Situations you did not choose. Circumstances that are beyond your influence. But how you respond to those situations, that is always within your control. And that response is what shapes your direction. When you take responsibility, you stop reacting passively. You stop letting situations define your behavior. Instead, you make decisions based on what moves you forward, regardless of what is happening around you. The shift changes everything. You begin to see your life as something you are actively building, not something that is happening to you. You stop waiting for permission. You stop expecting guidance. You stop hoping someone else will step in and make things easier. Because you understand that progress depends on your actions, not external support. Responsibility also brings clarity. When you own your decisions, you begin to see patterns more clearly. You recognize what is working and what isn't. You understand the connection between your actions and your results. And that understanding allows you to adjust, to improve, to move in a different direction. Without responsibility, everything feels uncertain. You don't know why things aren't changing. You don't know what to fix. You keep repeating the same behaviors, hoping for different outcomes. But with responsibility, the process becomes structured. You identify the problem. You take action. You evaluate the result. And you refine your approach. It becomes a system. Another important aspect of responsibility is accountability. Not to others, but to yourself. It is the ability to follow through on what you say you will do, even when no one is watching. Even when it's inconvenient. Even when it's difficult. Because real progress is not built in moments of visibility. It is built in moments of consistency. When you hold yourself accountable, you remove the gap between intention and action. You don't just plan, you execute. You don't just decide, you follow through. And over time, that consistency builds trust in yourself. That trust is critical. Because when you trust yourself, you rely less on external validation. You don't need constant motivation. You don't need someone to push you. You know that you will act regardless of how you feel. And that reliability becomes a foundation for growth. Responsibility also removes excuses. When you take ownership, you stop explaining why something didn't happen. You stop justifying inaction. Instead, you focus on what needs to be done next. You replace explanation with execution, and that shift accelerates progress. It's important to understand that responsibility is not about perfection. You will make mistakes. You will have setbacks. You will face challenges that disrupt your plans. But responsibility ensures that you do not stay there. It keeps you engaged in the process. It pushes you to adjust, to continue, to improve. It keeps you moving. Your life as it exists right now is a result of what has been repeated, your habits, your decisions, your actions. And while that may be difficult to accept, it is also empowering. Because if your past actions created your current situation, your current actions can create your future. But only if you take responsibility for them. No one is coming to manage your life. No one is coming to make your decisions. No one is coming to build your discipline. And once you fully accept that, something shifts. You stop waiting. You stop blaming. You start acting. Because when you take full responsibility, you stop being a participant in your life, and you become the one who directs it. Chapter 3. Stop waiting for the perfect moment. There is a common belief that holds people in place longer than they realize. The belief that the right moment will come. A time when everything feels aligned, when motivation is high, when conditions are ideal, and when starting becomes easy. Until then, they wait. They prepare. They think. But they don't act. This idea of the perfect moment is one of the most effective forms of delay. It feels logical. It feels responsible. You tell yourself you'll begin when you have more clarity, more time, or more energy. You convince yourself that starting later will lead to better results. But what you're actually doing is postponing action indefinitely because the conditions you're waiting for are rarely consistent and often don't exist at all. Perfect timing is an illusion. There will always be something missing, something incomplete, something that could be better. And if you base your actions on ideal conditions, you will remain inactive. Because reality does not operate in perfection. It operates in motion. Waiting creates a false sense of readiness. You feel like you're getting closer to starting when in reality you're maintaining distance from it. You collect information. You think through possibilities. You imagine outcomes. But none of that replaces action. And without action, nothing changes. The truth is, readiness is not a prerequisite. It is a result. You do not become ready before you start. You become ready because you start. When you take action, even in an imperfect state, you begin to understand what needs to be done. You gain clarity through experience. You adjust your approach based on feedback. And over time you improve. None of this happens while you're waiting. Action creates progress. Waiting preserves the current state. There is also a psychological comfort in waiting. It allows you to avoid risk. Because if you don't begin, you don't fail. If you delay, you protect yourself from uncertainty. But that protection comes at a cost. Because avoiding failure also means avoiding growth. Every day you wait is a day where nothing changes. Your habits remain the same. Your results remain the same. Your position remains the same. And over time, that stagnation builds frustration. Not because you lack potential, but because you are not applying it. Starting imperfectly is more effective than waiting perfectly. When you remove the expectation of ideal conditions, you reduce pressure. You stop trying to get everything right from the beginning. Instead, you focus on taking the first step. And that step, no matter how small, creates movement. Movement is what matters. Because once you begin, the next step becomes clearer. And the next after that. Progress builds incrementally. It does not require a perfect start. It requires a start that continues. Another reason people wait is the belief that they need confidence first. That they should feel certain before they act. But confidence does not come from thinking. It comes from doing. It is built through repetition, through small successes, through overcoming challenges. If you wait to feel confident, you will wait indefinitely. But if you act, even without confidence, you begin to build it. The same applies to clarity. Many people delay action because they feel uncertain about what to do. They want a complete plan before they begin. But clarity is not something you figure out in isolation. It is something you develop through action. When you start, you learn. You discover what works and what doesn't. You identify obstacles. You refine your approach. And with each step, your understanding improves. Waiting for clarity delays the process that creates it. You also need to understand that conditions improve after you begin, not before. You may think you need more time, more resources, or better circumstances. But in most cases, those factors become available as a result of action. Opportunities appear when you move. Resources align when you commit. But none of that happens while you're waiting. Action attracts progress. Waiting attracts stagnation. One of the most effective ways to break this pattern is to redefine what starting means. It does not have to be a major commitment. It does not have to be perfect. It simply needs to be immediate. A small, clear step that moves you forward. Because once you take that step, you shift from thinking to doing. And that shift changes your trajectory. It's also important to remove the idea of the right time from your mindset entirely. There is only the time you choose to act. And the sooner you act, the sooner you begin to build momentum. Momentum is what carries you forward. It reduces resistance. It makes continuation easier. It turns effort into routine. But momentum cannot exist without action. And action cannot exist while you are waiting. You don't need better timing. You need a decision. A decision to act despite uncertainty, despite imperfection, despite not feeling fully ready. Because the moment you stop waiting is the moment you take control. And once you take control, progress is no longer dependent on external conditions. It becomes dependent on you. Chapter 4. Build discipline without external pressure. Most people associate discipline with pressure. Deadlines, expectations, supervision, or consequences imposed by others. They perform well when someone is watching, when something is at stake, or when there is immediate accountability. But when that external pressure disappears, so does their consistency. This is where progress breaks. Because real discipline is not built on external force. It is built on internal standards. And if your actions depend on someone else pushing you, your progress will always be temporary. External pressure creates short-term performance. Internal discipline creates long-term results. When you rely on external factors to stay consistent, you lose control over your own behavior. You act when required, not when necessary. You respond to pressure instead of creating structure. And over time, this creates a dependency. You begin to need urgency, stress, or supervision to take action. But your life cannot be built on borrowed pressure. There will be no one consistently reminding you, forcing you, or holding you accountable at every step. And if you wait for that, you delay your own progress. Because the responsibility to act does not belong to anyone else. It belongs to you. Discipline begins with a decision. Not a feeling, not a moment of motivation, but a clear commitment to act regardless of how you feel. Because feelings are inconsistent. They change daily. They fluctuate with energy, mood, and circumstances. If your actions depend on them, your results will be unpredictable. Discipline removes that variability. It creates a standard that you follow even when it's inconvenient, even when you don't feel like it, even when there is no immediate reward. And that consistency is what builds momentum. One of the biggest misconceptions about discipline is that it requires extreme effort, that you need to push yourself aggressively, maintain high intensity, and operate at maximum capacity every day. But this approach is not sustainable. Discipline is not about intensity. It is about reliability. It's about doing what you said you would do consistently. Not perfectly, not excessively, but repeatedly. Because repetition builds patterns. And patterns build results. To develop discipline without external pressure, you need structure. Clear, defined actions that are not negotiable. These actions should be simple, specific, and tied to your daily routine. When something is part of your structure, it no longer depends on motivation. It becomes a standard. For example, instead of deciding whether you will act each day, you remove the decision entirely. You define what will be done and when it will be done. This reduces hesitation. It eliminates the need to negotiate with yourself. And over time, it becomes automatic. Another key element is reducing friction. If your tasks are too complex, too demanding, or unclear, you will resist them. Not because you lack discipline, but because the process itself creates resistance. Simplifying your actions makes consistency easier. Smaller, manageable steps are more sustainable than large, irregular efforts. Discipline grows through repetition, not force. You also need to understand the role of discomfort. Acting without external pressure often feels harder because there is no immediate consequence for inaction. No one is watching. No one is expecting results right away. And in that space, it's easy to delay. But discipline is built in those moments. When you choose to act without pressure, you strengthen your control over your behavior. You prove to yourself that you can follow through, even without urgency. And that builds confidence, not the kind that comes from success, but the kind that comes from reliability. Accountability to yourself is essential. This means setting standards and holding yourself to them. Not through punishment, but through consistency. If you commit to something, you follow through. Not because someone else expects it, but because you do. This shifts your mindset. You stop seeing actions as optional. You stop negotiating with yourself. You begin to operate with intention. And over time, that intention becomes automatic behavior. Another important factor is identity. Discipline is not just about what you do. It's about who you become. Each time you follow through, you reinforce the identity of someone who is consistent, someone who acts, someone who does not rely on external pressure to move forward. And that identity strengthens your behavior. Because when your actions align with how you see yourself, consistency becomes natural. It's also important to remove the need for immediate results. Discipline often feels unrewarding in the beginning because progress is not always visible. But the value is not in the immediate outcome. It's in the pattern you are building. And that pattern, over time, produces results that intensity alone cannot achieve. You don't need someone to push you. You need a system that guides you. You need standards that you follow. You need actions that you repeat. Because in the end, discipline is not about doing more. It's about doing what matters, consistently, without relying on anything outside of you. And once you build that, you no longer depend on pressure. You create your own progress. Chapter 5. Eliminate excuses completely. Excuses rarely sound like excuses. They sound reasonable, logical, even justified. You tell yourself you're too tired, too busy, not ready, or waiting for a better time. You explain why something didn't happen instead of confronting why you didn't make it happen. And over time, these explanations become automatic. They feel normal. But beneath that normality is a pattern that quietly blocks progress. Excuses protect your current position. They remove pressure. They reduce discomfort. They give you a way to avoid action without feeling like you've failed. But they also come with a hidden cost. Because every excuse you accept reinforces inaction. And inaction, repeated over time, becomes your default behavior. The problem is not that you don't know what to do. In most cases, you already do. The problem is that in the moment of action, you choose comfort over responsibility. And excuses are the tool that makes that choice feel acceptable. I'll do it later. This is one of the most common excuses. It doesn't sound like avoidance. It sounds like postponement. But later is rarely defined. It becomes a moving point, something that keeps shifting forward. And as long as it remains undefined, it allows you to delay indefinitely. Later is not a time. It is a pattern. Another common excuse is waiting for the right condition. More time, more energy, more clarity. But these conditions are often used as justification, not necessity. Because if you look closely, you'll see that action is possible even without them. Not perfect action, but progress. Excuses are not about reality. They are about interpretation. You interpret your situation in a way that allows you to avoid discomfort. You tell yourself that your circumstances are the reason you're not acting. But often the real reason is resistance. Resistance to effort. Resistance to uncertainty. Resistance to doing something that feels difficult. Eliminating excuses requires awareness. You need to recognize them as they happen. Not after the fact, not during reflection, but in the moment. When you hear yourself explaining why something can't be done, pause. Question it. Ask yourself, is this a real limitation or am I avoiding responsibility? This question disrupts the pattern, because it forces you to confront the difference between a genuine obstacle and a convenient explanation. Taking responsibility changes your response. Instead of saying, I didn't have time, you ask, how can I make time? Instead of saying, I'm not ready, you ask, what can I do right now? This shift moves you from explanation to action, from delay to movement. Responsibility does not eliminate difficulty. It changes how you respond to it. There will be days when you feel tired, days when your energy is low, days when your environment is not ideal. But eliminating excuses means acting anyway. Not at full intensity, not perfectly, but consistently. Because consistency breaks patterns. One of the most effective ways to eliminate excuses is to reduce decision-making. The more you rely on choosing whether to act, the more opportunities you create for excuses. Instead, define your actions in advance. Decide what will be done and when. Remove the negotiation. When there is no decision to make, there is no space for excuses. Another important factor is honesty. Excuses often exist because you are not being fully honest with yourself. You say you didn't have time, but time was spent elsewhere. You say you weren't ready, but you didn't attempt to start. You say you'll do it later, but you haven't defined when. Honesty removes distortion. It shows you what is actually happening, not what you tell yourself is happening. And once you see that clearly, it becomes harder to justify inaction. It's also important to understand that excuses are reinforced through repetition. The more you accept them, the easier they become. They turn into habits, automatic responses that require no effort. And over time, they shape your identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who delays, avoids, or postpones. Breaking this requires interruption. Every time you replace an excuse with action, you weaken the pattern. You create a new response. And with enough repetition, that response becomes your default. Excuses also limit your perception of control. They make you feel like your situation is determined by external factors. But when you remove them, you begin to see how much is actually within your influence. Your actions, your decisions, your effort. And that awareness increases your ability to act. You don't need perfect conditions to move forward. You need to stop justifying why you're not. Because progress is not built on explanations. It is built on action. Every excuse you eliminate brings you closer to consistency. Every action you take, despite discomfort, builds momentum. And over time, that momentum replaces the need for excuses entirely. Because when you become someone who acts, regardless of conditions, excuses lose their purpose. And without them, nothing stands between you and progress. Chapter 6. Focus on what you can control. One of the fastest ways to lose momentum is to focus on what you cannot control. Other people's actions, unexpected events, outcomes that depend on external factors. These are all parts of life that remain uncertain. And when your attention is constantly pulled toward them, your energy becomes scattered. You think more, worry more, and act less. Lack of control creates frustration. You try to predict outcomes. You try to manage variables that are not yours to manage. And when things don't go as expected, you feel stuck. Not because you lack ability, but because your focus is misplaced. Control is not about managing everything. It is about directing your attention toward what is within your influence. Your thoughts, your actions, your responses, these are always within your control. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently. And when you focus on these areas, your effectiveness increases. Because you are working with variables you can actually change. Most people reverse this. They spend time thinking about outcomes instead of actions. They worry about results before doing the work. They get caught in uncertainty and delay movement. But outcomes are a result of actions. And actions are what you control. When you shift your focus to action, you reduce unnecessary complexity. You stop asking, "What will happen?" and start asking, "What can I do next?" That question is direct. It leads to movement. It keeps you engaged in the process instead of lost in possibilities. This shift also reduces stress, because stress often comes from trying to control what you cannot. You anticipate problems. You imagine negative outcomes. You try to prepare for every possibility. And in doing so, you exhaust your mental energy without making progress. Focusing on what you can control simplifies everything. It narrows your attention. It gives you a clear direction. And it allows you to act without waiting for certainty. Another important aspect is accepting uncertainty. You will not always know how things will turn out. You will not have full control over results. But waiting for certainty delays action. And action is what creates clarity. When you act, you gather information. You see what works and what doesn't. You adjust your approach. You improve your decisions. But none of that happens while you're trying to control outcomes in advance. Control is built through response. You cannot control every situation, but you can control how you respond to it. And that response determines your direction. If you react with delay, avoidance, or frustration, you reinforce stagnation. If you respond with action, adjustment, and consistency, you create progress. This is where responsibility and control intersect. When you take responsibility, you focus on your role in the situation. When you focus on control, you act within that role. Together, they create a system where your energy is directed toward movement, not distraction. It's also important to recognize how much time is wasted on uncontrollable factors. Thinking about what others are doing. Comparing your progress to someone else's. Waiting for conditions to improve. These behaviors do not contribute to your progress. They consume attention without producing results. Shifting your focus requires discipline. You need to actively redirect your attention when it moves toward things you cannot control. When you notice yourself worrying about outcomes, bring your focus back to action. When you catch yourself comparing, return to your own process. This is not a one-time adjustment. It is a repeated practice. Over time, it becomes automatic. You begin to operate with clarity. You stop overthinking. You stop waiting. You start acting. Another benefit of focusing on control is efficiency. When your attention is aligned with your actions, your effort becomes more effective. You spend less time thinking and more time doing. And that shift accelerates progress. It also builds confidence. Not the kind that comes from guaranteed outcomes, but the kind that comes from knowing you can act regardless of uncertainty. You trust your ability to respond. You trust your ability to adjust. And that trust reduces hesitation. You don't need control over everything to move forward. You need control over your actions. Because progress is not determined by perfect conditions or predictable outcomes. It is determined by consistent effort in the areas you can influence. When you focus on what you can control, you remove distractions. You remove unnecessary thinking. You remove delays. And in their place, you create movement. Because in the end, your life does not change based on what happens around you. It changes based on what you do within it. Chapter 7. Build daily systems that force progress. Motivation is unreliable. It rises and falls based on mood, energy, and external conditions. If your progress depends on it, your results will always be inconsistent. That's why relying on motivation alone keeps you in cycles of starting and stopping. What you need instead is a system, something structured, repeatable, and independent of how you feel. A system is not a goal. It is the process that moves you toward that goal. Most people focus on outcomes. They think about what they want to achieve, where they want to be, and how things should look in the future. But without a system, those outcomes remain abstract. They exist in intention, not in execution. A system converts intention into action. It defines what you will do, when you will do it, and how often you will repeat it. Systems remove uncertainty. When you have a clear structure, you don't spend time deciding whether to act. The decision is already made. You simply follow the process. This eliminates hesitation. It reduces mental friction. And it allows you to move forward without constant negotiation. One of the most important characteristics of a system is simplicity. If your system is too complex, you won't maintain it. If it requires too many decisions, too much effort, or too much variation, it becomes difficult to repeat. And anything that is difficult to repeat will eventually stop. That's why effective systems are built on small, consistent actions. You don't need a perfect system. You need a sustainable one. Start by defining a few key actions that directly contribute to your progress. Not everything, just the essentials. What are the actions that, if repeated daily, would move you forward? Focus on those. Make them clear. Make them specific. And integrate them into your routine. Timing is also important. When actions are tied to specific times or triggers, they become easier to follow. Instead of deciding when to act, you follow a schedule. This reduces reliance on memory and willpower. It turns action into a habit rather than a choice. For example, instead of saying, "I'll work on this today," define when and how long. Specificity increases consistency. Another critical element is reducing friction. Your system should make it easier to act, not harder. If there are barriers, unclear steps, lack of preparation, unnecessary complexity, you will avoid the process. Remove those barriers. Prepare in advance. Create an environment that supports your system. Because when the path is clear, action becomes automatic. Systems also reduce decision fatigue. Every decision you make consumes mental energy. And when you have to decide repeatedly throughout the day, your ability to act decreases. A system eliminates many of those decisions. It defines what needs to be done so you don't have to think about it repeatedly. This preserves your energy for execution. Consistency is the foundation of any system. It's not about doing more. It's about doing the same essential actions repeatedly. Because repetition builds momentum. And momentum makes continuation easier. When you follow a system daily, it becomes part of your routine. It no longer feels like something you have to force. It becomes something you do. Another important aspect is adaptability. Your system should not be rigid to the point where it breaks under pressure. Life will not always follow your plan. There will be disruptions, unexpected changes, and difficult days. A strong system accounts for that. It allows flexibility without losing consistency. This means having a minimum standard. On days when everything is aligned, you can do more. But on difficult days, you fall back to the minimum. This prevents complete stops. It keeps the pattern intact. And maintaining the pattern is more important than maintaining intensity. Tracking your system can also improve consistency. Not as a form of pressure, but as a form of awareness. When you see your actions over time, you understand what you are actually repeating. You identify gaps. You adjust. And that awareness strengthens your commitment. It also creates accountability. Not to others, but to yourself. When you build and follow a system, you shift from reactive behavior to proactive structure. You stop relying on how you feel. You stop waiting for the right moment. You operate based on what you've defined as necessary. And that changes your relationship with action. It becomes consistent. It becomes reliable. It becomes part of who you are. Over time, the results of your system begin to appear. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. Because systems work through accumulation. Small actions, repeated consistently, produce outcomes that intensity alone cannot achieve. You don't need to push yourself constantly. You need to guide yourself consistently. A system does that. It keeps you moving when motivation fades. It keeps you aligned when distractions appear. It keeps you progressing when conditions are not ideal. Because in the end, your life is not shaped by what you do occasionally. It is shaped by what your system makes you repeat every day. Chapter 8. Develop mental toughness for challenges. Progress is not a straight path. It is unpredictable, uneven, and often uncomfortable. There will be resistance. There will be setbacks. There will be moments where things do not go as planned, where effort does not immediately translate into results, and where continuing feels difficult. This is not an exception to the process. It is the process. And the ability to move through these moments without stopping is what defines mental toughness. Mental toughness is not about being emotionless or unaffected. It is about maintaining action despite discomfort. It is the ability to stay consistent when things are not ideal, to continue when motivation is low, and to respond to challenges with control instead of avoidance. Most people struggle not because the task is too difficult, but because they are not prepared for the discomfort that comes with it. They expect progress to feel smooth. They expect effort to feel rewarding. And when reality does not match that expectation, they begin to doubt the process. They slow down. They stop. And the cycle repeats. Mental toughness removes that expectation. It prepares you for difficulty in advance. It sets a standard where discomfort is not a signal to stop, but a signal that you are moving in the right direction. One of the first steps in developing mental toughness is changing how you interpret challenges. Instead of seeing them as obstacles, see them as part of the process. Every challenge you face is an opportunity to strengthen your ability to respond. It forces you to adapt. It pushes you to think differently. And over time, it builds resilience. Avoiding challenges delays growth. Facing them builds strength. There is also a difference between reacting and responding. A reaction is automatic. It is driven by emotion. When something becomes difficult, you feel frustration, resistance, or doubt, and you act based on that feeling. A response, on the other hand, is controlled. It is intentional. You recognize the difficulty, but you continue anyway. Mental toughness is built in the space between reaction and response. When you choose to act instead of react, you strengthen your control. Another important aspect is endurance. Not physical endurance, but mental endurance, the ability to sustain effort over time. Many people can start strong. Few can continue when the process becomes repetitive and slow. But that is where results are built. Endurance requires patience. You need to understand that progress is not always visible. There will be periods where you are doing the right things but not seeing immediate results. And in those moments, it is easy to question your effort. But mental toughness allows you to continue without needing constant validation. It keeps you aligned with the process, not the outcome. Discomfort is a constant factor in growth. It appears in different forms: fatigue, uncertainty, frustration, doubt. And if you avoid these feelings, you limit your ability to move forward. Because growth requires you to operate outside of what is comfortable. Mental toughness is not about eliminating discomfort. It is about increasing your tolerance for it. The more you expose yourself to challenging situations, the more familiar they become. And familiarity reduces resistance. What once felt difficult becomes manageable. What once felt overwhelming becomes routine. This is how strength is built. Through repeated exposure, not avoidance. It's also important to manage your internal dialogue. The way you talk to yourself during difficult moments influences your behavior. If your thoughts are negative, uncertain, or focused on quitting, your actions will reflect that. But if you maintain clarity and direction, you are more likely to continue. This does not mean forcing positive thinking. It means focusing on what needs to be done next. Simple, direct thinking leads to action. Overthinking leads to delay. Another key factor is commitment. Mental toughness is not situational. It is consistent. It does not depend on how you feel or what is happening around you. It is based on a decision to continue regardless of conditions. When you commit fully, you remove the option of stopping. You may adjust your approach. You may change your pace. But you do not stop. This creates stability. Because your progress is no longer dependent on external factors. It is driven by your commitment to continue. It's also important to understand that mental toughness develops over time. You do not become resilient instantly. It is built through repeated experiences. Each challenge you face and move through strengthens your ability to handle the next one. And over time, your threshold increases. What once stopped you no longer does. What once felt difficult becomes part of your normal. And that shift changes your entire approach to progress. You stop fearing challenges. You start expecting them. And when they appear, you are prepared, not because they are easy, but because you have trained yourself to continue. Your life will not become easier, but you will become stronger. And that strength allows you to move forward regardless of difficulty. Because in the end, progress is not determined by how you perform when things are easy. It is determined by how you respond when they are not. Chapter 9. Create your own opportunities. Many people spend years waiting for an opportunity that feels right. A moment where everything aligns, where the path becomes clear, and where action feels justified. They believe opportunities are something that appear, something external that must be found or given. And because of that belief, they wait. But opportunities are rarely found. They are created. Waiting for opportunity keeps you passive. It places your progress in the hands of timing, luck, or external circumstances. And while those factors may play a role, they are not the foundation of progress. Action is. Because every time you take initiative, you create movement. And movement creates possibilities. Opportunity is a result of action, not a condition for it. When you act, even in small ways, you begin to shift your environment. You learn new things. You meet new people. You encounter new challenges. And each of these experiences opens doors that were not visible before. But if you remain inactive, those doors never appear. This is why two people in the same situation can experience completely different outcomes. One waits, the other acts, and over time the gap between them grows, not because of talent but because of initiative. Initiative is the starting point. It is the decision to act without waiting for permission, without waiting for certainty, and without waiting for someone else to lead. It is the willingness to take the first step, even when the outcome is unclear. Most people hesitate because they want guarantees. They want to know that their effort will lead to results, that their time will not be wasted. But guarantees do not exist in progress. Every action carries uncertainty. And if you wait for certainty, you eliminate the possibility of growth. Action creates feedback. When you take a step, you receive information. You see what works and what doesn't. You adjust your approach. And through that process, you move closer to your objective. Without action, there is no feedback. And without feedback, there is no improvement. Another important aspect of creating opportunities is visibility. When you act consistently, your efforts become noticeable. Not necessarily to others at first, but within your own system. You begin to see patterns. You recognize where you can improve. And over time, your work starts to produce results that can be built upon. Visibility also applies externally. When you engage, contribute, and participate, you increase your exposure. You create connections. You place yourself in environments where opportunities are more likely to arise. But if you remain inactive, your visibility remains low. And opportunities rarely reach those who are not engaged. Effort creates access. The more you do, the more access you gain, to knowledge, to networks, to possibilities. And that access expands your options. It gives you more paths to explore, more directions to move in. Waiting limits your options. It keeps you in the same position with the same possibilities. And over time, that limitation becomes a pattern. You begin to expect opportunities to come to you. And when they don't, you feel stuck. Creating opportunities requires a shift in mindset. Instead of asking, what opportunity is available? Ask, what can I create? This question changes your role. You are no longer searching. You are building. You are taking control of your direction. This does not mean every action will lead to immediate results. Many will not. But each action contributes to a larger process. It builds experience. It develops skill. It increases awareness. And over time, these factors combine to create outcomes that were not possible before. Consistency is key. One action is not enough. One attempt is not enough. Opportunities are created through repeated effort, through continuous engagement, through a willingness to keep moving even when results are not immediate. This is where most people stop. They act once or twice, don't see results, and return to waiting. But creating opportunities requires persistence. It requires you to continue even when progress feels slow. You also need to be willing to take responsibility for your direction. Opportunities are not separate from your actions. They are a direct result of them. And when you understand that, you stop waiting for external change. You start creating internal movement. This movement leads to external results, new paths, new options, new outcomes. It's also important to remove the idea that opportunities must be large or obvious. Often they begin as small chances, minor actions, simple steps. But when you act on them, they expand. They lead to something else. And over time, those small beginnings become significant. If you ignore them, they disappear. If you act on them, they grow. Your life is not defined by the opportunities you are given. It is defined by the opportunities you create. Because in the end, waiting keeps you in place. Action moves you forward. And the more you move, the more possibilities you create. You don't need to wait for a better situation. You need to build one. And that begins the moment you decide to act. Chapter 10. Act daily like it's your responsibility. Understanding responsibility is not enough. Accepting it is not enough. Even deciding to change is not enough. Because your life does not shift based on what you think or what you intend. It shifts based on what you do every single day. Responsibility is not a one-time realization. It is a daily application. Most people have moments of clarity. They realize what they need to do. They feel motivated to take control. They decide to change. But without consistent action, that clarity fades. It becomes another thought, another intention that never translated into results. Action is what makes responsibility real. Not occasional action, not bursts of effort, but daily, repeated behavior that aligns with your decisions. Because consistency is what turns responsibility into progress. Every day presents the same question. Will you act or will you delay? And your answer, repeated over time, defines your direction. Acting daily does not mean doing everything at once. It means doing what matters consistently. Small, focused actions that move you forward. Because progress is not built in large, isolated efforts. It is built in small, repeated ones. One of the biggest challenges is maintaining this standard without external pressure. There will be no one reminding you every day. No one forcing you to follow through. No immediate consequence for missing a day. And in that absence, it becomes easy to relax your standards. But responsibility means maintaining those standards anyway. It means showing up when you don't feel like it. Acting when it's inconvenient. Continuing when progress is slow. Because your commitment is not based on conditions. It is based on your decision to take control. Daily action builds momentum. Each time you follow through, you reinforce the pattern. You strengthen the habit. You reduce resistance. And over time, what once required effort becomes automatic. This is how discipline becomes part of your identity. Momentum also reduces the need for motivation. When you act daily, you don't rely on how you feel. The action becomes part of your routine. Something you do regardless of mood or energy. And that consistency creates stability. But this requires structure. You need clear actions that are tied to your day. Not vague intentions, but specific tasks. What will you do? When will you do it? How long will it take? The more defined your actions are, the easier they are to repeat. Clarity removes hesitation. Hesitation creates delay. Another important factor is maintaining a minimum standard. There will be days when your energy is low, when your schedule is disrupted, when things don't go as planned. On those days, you may not be able to perform at your best, but you can still act. Having a minimum standard ensures that you never stop completely. Even small action maintains the pattern. And maintaining the pattern is more important than maintaining intensity. It's also important to remove the idea that you need to feel ready. Readiness is not required for action. Waiting to feel prepared only delays the process. Acting daily, even in an imperfect state, builds readiness over time. You become capable by doing, not by waiting. Another aspect of daily responsibility is tracking your behavior. Not for pressure, but for awareness. When you see your actions over time, you understand what you are actually repeating. You identify gaps. You adjust. And that awareness keeps you aligned with your goals. It also creates accountability, because you can no longer rely on memory or assumption. You see the reality of your effort. Consistency also builds identity. When you act daily, you begin to see yourself differently. Not as someone who tries occasionally, but as someone who follows through. Someone who takes responsibility seriously. And that identity reinforces your behavior, because you act in alignment with who you believe you are. It's important to understand that results will not appear immediately. There will be a period where you are acting consistently without visible change. And in that period, it is easy to question your effort. But this is where most people stop. And stopping resets the process. If you continue, results will follow. If you stop, the cycle repeats. Responsibility requires patience. It requires trust in the process. Not blind trust, but trust built on consistent action. You know that if you continue, progress is inevitable. Because repetition creates results. Your life is not changed by what you do once. It is changed by what you do daily. And every day you act, you move slightly forward. Every day you delay, you remain where you are. The difference may not be visible immediately, but over time, it becomes significant. You don't need more time. You don't need better conditions. You need to act, consistently, intentionally, daily. Because no one is coming to take responsibility for your life. That role belongs to you. And the moment you apply it every day, everything begins to change. No one is coming. And now you understand what that really means. It doesn't mean you're alone. It means you're in control. There is no moment waiting to arrive that will suddenly change everything. No external force that will build your discipline, make your decisions, or create your future for you. And once you accept that fully, something shifts. You stop waiting. You stop hoping for better conditions, better timing, or someone else to make things easier. You stop explaining why things haven't changed. And instead you start acting. Not perfectly, but consistently. Because you've seen the pattern. You've understood the cost of delay, of excuses, of dependence. And you know now that progress is not something that happens to you. It's something you create, through daily action, through responsibility, through decisions that move you forward even when it's difficult. There will still be challenges. There will still be days where it feels easier to go back to old patterns. But now you have clarity. And clarity removes the illusion that you can wait your way into a better life. You can't. You have to build it, step by step, action by action, day by day. And over time, those actions become your advantage. They separate you from the version of yourself that used to wait. They create momentum. They build something real. Your life does not change because someone saves you. It changes because you take responsibility and act. So the question is no longer whether change is possible. The question is simple. Will you keep waiting for something that isn't coming? Or will you take control and move forward anyway?